Eric Salahub here with part 4 of Why We Lecture and Why We Shouldn't. And so if you are jumping in at part 4, you can pause this and close it out, go back and start with part 1 if you want to. So I left you at the end of part 3 thinking about the third major reason we lecture, which is we lecture because we have important skills that we want students to learn, and that by demonstrating and doing and performing those skills, we're going to somehow get students to learn those skills. We're going to now transition to thinking about lecture discussion. And so maybe parts 1, 2, and 3 were framed around that continuous exposition by the teacher, right? That we're up there talking and doing all of the work. And I think those, we lecture to cover content, and so we just talk and talk and talk, and we lecture to get students to learn skills, and so it's us doing it. And we looked at some criticisms of those two reasons, but maybe you don't think that's what you do. Maybe you think this is really what I do. I'm not a lecturer, I am a discussion leader, right? And so I'm still doing a lot of the talking, but I'm really engaging students. I'm allowing them to ask questions. I'm encouraging them to ask questions. I'm pausing to let them ask questions. Maybe I'm even calling on them and asking them questions or trying to get them to talk to each other. And so, I'm doing something different. I'm doing a lecture discussion, and maybe those other criticisms don't apply here. If I can get my slides to advance. So the first thing I'll just ask you is to consider, is there really as big a difference between these two types of lectures as you want there to be? I'm at least going to ask you to entertain the idea that while we call it a lecture discussion, it is often simply continuous exposition by the teacher in disguise. And so my friend and colleague Carrie Mitchell calls this particular type of lecture call and response. I have a lecture that I need to get through, and I'm simply going to pause briefly during my sentence and stop and hope a student will fill in the blank. And so I could not help but to put a little screenshot from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And this was the riveting economics lecturer, and he is giving a lecture and he stops, anyone, fill in the blank for me so I can continue with my lecture. This is really just a continuous exposition by the teacher where you're hoping a student will say some of the words that you would have said. It's better than a continuous exposition by the teacher, because if a student actually does fill in the word that you want them to fill in, at least they had to do some work. But let's just be honest with ourselves. Who's doing most of the work during the typical quote-unquote lecture discussion? You're probably still talking the majority of the time because it's a lecture discussion, and so you're still covering content. And then even when you stop to get students involved, you're probably answering the students' questions some of the time, or even if you're not answering, you're trying to facilitate the conversation between students. You're deciding when to stop and let them talk, how often, how long to let them talk, how long to entertain tangents, and you're still primarily in control. A big problem with a lecture discussion is simply that there are two opposing goals. And I'm not suggesting that they both can't work together, but they are opposing goals, and they are, I think, actually working against each other. The maximal discussion would have no lecture. If you value the discussion, the student involvement part, then the best discussion would be all students discussing and no transmission of knowledge. But the maximal lecture has no discussion. If your goal is to transmit knowledge, then every time you stop to let students talk, you're moving away from that goal. And so if you have these two goals, transmitting knowledge and covering content, and having students engaged with that content, those are working at odds with each other. And you're going to have to decide how much do you let one goal work toward its achievement, and how much time do you spend on the other one. And I know you're with me here. You've been in this situation where I've got my slides to cover, and I'm going to stop and let students talk, but I know I can't let them talk too long because I'm looking at the clock and I see how many slides I have left. And so I'm trying to hurry students along, or I don't get through all my content, and so the last 10 minutes I have to click really quickly. And so there's a tension between two of the goals of the lecture and the discussion. Another problem is, as we mentioned in part 2, I think, that content is really important. Students need to have the content in order to have a meaningful discussion about it. And so if you are giving them the content in the lecture, and that's the first exposure, or that's really where you're actually transmitting the knowledge from your brain to their brain, and that transmission of knowledge is a prerequisite for students to move up Bloom's taxonomy and do something about it, then we have to expect that students are going to struggle in a lecture discussion, because they're literally hearing the information for maybe the first time and trying to quote unquote learn it, and then you're asking them to ask a meaningful question about it, or answer a meaningful question about it, or even harder, join into meaningful conversation or discussion about it. And that's hard. You can do it because you've known that content for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And so you can talk about it anytime you want. There are some students that really can participate in meaningful discussion in the middle of a lecture. That's the handful of students that did the reading, that worked hard because they were intrinsically motivated or they came with prior knowledge. They didn't need your lecture. They're sitting there bored, waiting for a chance to jump in and ask those questions that their outside of class work prompted. The problem is when they ask those questions that you're ready for because they did their homework, the other students in class have no clue what they're talking about, right? Because they're only at that basic acquisition of knowledge level. That handful of students that actually did the homework have awesome ideas, but you can't spend your whole class talking about it because most of the students, it's over their head. And you'll get some students who will try to participate because you want them to and they want to impress you. And they're the ones who are asking the questions that are very simple that they should have probably gotten from the homework, or they ask a tangential question or a question that's so far out of left field just because they're trying so hard to participate. And so then you have the struggle of, do I entertain this tangent or this question that really doesn't make sense that because it was asked out of ignorance? I'm not saying it was a stupid question. It's a meaningful question, but it's really not helping move the class where you want it to go. And so you've got these two groups of students who are participating, right? Some of them didn't need the lecture, and they're frustrated because you can't discuss the level they want to. You got this other group of students who participate, and they're participating, but it's actually moving you the wrong direction, right? And then you've got the other portion of your students, I don't know how many, half or more, that probably don't say anything unless you make them, and then they resist. I spent a lot of years working in online learning. This exact dynamic happens in online classes, and I think one of the main question in my 5 years as an online instructional coach was, how come my online discussions don't work as well as I want them to? And one of the main reasons is people were asking students to do a lecture discussion. They made a very complex discussion question. Talk about the right answer and then discuss it. And so you had students in the same discussion trying to get the right answer and then trying to talk about it. And it's extremely confusing because students are wrong, and you have to get in the discussion and make sure you're policing all of their wrong answers. And then some students are reading those wrong answers and trying to talk about them. And so it's just a real hassle, and it's chaotic and confusing. In my own class, I would be frustrated because students would start discussing and it would just be really hard, right? I mean, they wouldn't be talking about anything meaningful because they didn't understand the content. And I don't mean completely understand it, I just mean they didn't have a basic currency with the facts that led to productive discussion. And so a few years ago, I implemented quizzing to mastery. So in my online class now, students must do the reading. They don't get lectures, right? It's an online class. They watch some video clips, they do the reading, then they take a quiz that's on the basic content, and they must quiz until they get 100%. This is not mastery of the concepts of the class, but it is mastery of the basic facts so that students can then go into the discussion and start off in a productive way. And once I implemented this quizzing to mastery scheme, the online discussions in my class, I mean, it's not it's night and day. It's a complete difference. And so this is, I think, the same, it's a version of what's happening in many of our lecture discussion classes. So quizzing to mastery may be a way to help students in an online class deal with this. And food for thought, this would probably also work in a face-to-face class. So let's come at this from a slightly different angle and make the same point. Why do we lecture? We lecture because we tell students to study. They come to class unprepared. So we lecture because they need the content, and then they realize they don't need to study, and so they don't study, and then we start this vicious cycle, this unvirtuous cycle of this codependent relationship that fits squarely into the transmission of knowledge paradigm, where we're lecturing during class because they need the content, and students are the passive absorbers of content, and they're not doing the work in class, and they're not really doing that much work outside of class, and so this is this dynamic that we have. And what can we do about it? Well, one thing we can do is we can realize that students don't know how to study. Now, some of them are simply not studying, but many of them are probably trying to study. They're just not learning much from their studying, and that can be very frustrating when students are spending many, many hours studying and they're not getting any traction. And again, I would just ask you to come to the conclusion, I hope, that why would we expect students to know how to study? There is a science of learning that talks about very specific study strategies that are research-based and have been proven to be effective. And many of the strategies that students use are not just not effective strategies, they are ineffective strategies. And so I think we just need to help our students by telling them what studying means and building the studying into the class by designing homework assignments and in-class assignments that demonstrate good learning skills and that force students to do the learning so that we can break that vicious cycle. And again, quizzing to mastery, just mentioned it 2 seconds ago. This is a very powerful learning strategy because every time a student recalls information, they're learning it. So not only does this help us actually go into class and have a discussion, it's also helping students learn that content. And so this is, when I ask my students, require them to quiz to mastery, I'm telling them that that's what studying is. You take a pretest and you don't do well, and then you go do the reading, and then you come back and take a quiz again, and you get a 60%, which tells you that there was more in that reading than you got out of it the first time. And so go back to the reading again and see if you can figure out what you got wrong, and then come and take the quiz again. And I was just talking to my students yesterday. This is a clip from several semesters ago. I have a face-to-face class with 22 students, and 22 of them took the quiz. All but one got 100%. But most of them took 6 or 7 attempts to get the right answer. Some of them were guessing. But I knew that they had actually spent a lot of time outside of class struggling with that content before they came to class. And that allowed me to do something very different in class when I looked at the statistics before class. I could also, of course, look at the individual questions to figure out which ones were they really struggling on. If you want to go into class and have that meaningful discussion, maybe you want to have your students quiz to mastery. And if you don't think the textbook is sufficient for them to learn the content, if you think your presentation of that content and those skills that you do in class summarizes, or those examples that you gave are so important, why don't you just video record your lectures? I mean, I don't have to worry about discussion. I can focus right now simply on making this the best lecture possible. My only goal is to transmit knowledge to you. And you could do what I'm doing. You could do a video version of your lecture, put it in D2L, force students to watch it before class. That's still valuing your lecture. You're still the sage on the stage. You're just making them do the lecture outside of class. And then what happens when they come to class, maybe having watched your video lecture, quizzing to mastery on some content questions? What would that discussion look like now? And I don't know if you like video lectures, you're watching one right now, but students can watch them anytime, anywhere. They can watch them on their phone, they can watch them on their tablet, they can watch them hopefully not while they're driving. They can rewind. This should say replay. They can watch it as many times as they want. They can't reply, but they could send you a message. They could go to a discussion board and talk about something. Since you're watching a YouTube video right now, why don't you click on the CC button? That's Google's artificial intelligence creating captions. And you tell me, how perfect are they? In my experience, Google right now is not 100% accurate, but really close. So I am not sure these are ADA compliant, but for universal design, it's pretty cool. Students that might struggle to hear what you're saying, or you're talking too fast, not only can they replay the video lecture, they can download a transcript and read it, and that's good for all students. You know, I could have just done one 2-hour lecture, which I know no one would have finished, or very few of you. I'm almost at 18 minutes now. Clearly, I'm over your attention span. But you could take a lecture and break it into parts, like I'm doing. You could put these parts into a quiz in your D2L site or some other LMS. You could say, for homework, do this quiz. And the quiz is going to take you 90 minutes. But that's okay, because you were supposed to do 2 to 3 hours of homework. Here's your homework. Take this 90-minute guided thinking activity. When they click on question 1, well, guess what? They're going to watch a 10-minute video of you lecturing, and then they're going to do something like do some writing, solve some problems, and submit that. And then question 2 is going to be video part 2. And my sense is almost any lecture would be as good or better in that format. Now, what would your students be able to do in class if they completed a 90-minute guided thinking activity where they had to interact with your lectures and do some writing and thinking, and then you actually got to look at that material before class? Because of course you could ask your students to watch that and answer those questions before class, and if nothing else, you could tell which ones of them actually watched you before they come to class. Come back for the next part when we can talk about lecture as storytelling. Sorry about that. We're not done yet. I'm going to give you lecture as storytelling and then ask you to take a pause. So, lecture as storytelling. A lot of us do this, and a lot of our favorite lecturers do this. And if you like TED Talks, you know, that captivating storyteller that's passionate, you're crafting that story to make connections with the content. It's the way you weave in your anecdotes and your examples, and you've got that powerful story. I think there's a lot of food for thought about storytelling, and I am just going to offer a little bit of I don't know, maybe a few criticisms that might give you pause or help you think about how you would decide when to tell a story and when not to tell a story. Well, I will say this: if you can tell a good story and be creative about your content, that really does demonstrate your mastery of the content and skills. But I do think it's worth thinking about a tension here between good storytelling and lectures. So, why are you telling the story? If the story is intended to transmit knowledge, then I think there's a tension. But at least for me, a good story is often captivating because it's intentionally mysterious or ambiguous or vague. It's leaving some things up to the story listener to come up with on their own. There's a moral or a point that you're hoping your listeners will get to, but you don't always tell them what it is. And so I think it's really important to think about, if I have a point to the story I'm telling, are students actually getting the point? And if you really want them to get the point and you really want to cover content, then your story is probably going to be didactic and boring. It will cover more content and be less vague and ambiguous, but it won't be as captivating and interesting. And so I think there's a tension there. And I think maybe what we would want to do is give students an opportunity to create their own stories. Because if a student can craft a story using the content and skills of the course and connecting it with their own lives, that's going to demonstrate their proficiency and mastery with the content. That being said, we have been a storytelling species for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So this oral tradition is clearly extremely powerful, and I am not denying the potential for storytelling. I just think you want to think about what the outcomes are. And again, is it worth using precious class time for those stories when you could have maybe done a screencast of the story or wrote the story? Again, just food for thought on your precious class time and what you would want to do. Maybe you want to ask students to create some stories and come up with their own examples and make their own connections. And so now we really are going to pause. I would invite you to think about lecture discussion and lecture as storytelling and some of the pros and cons that we've talked about, and do some writing and thinking about those aspects of lecture, and then come back for the next part, please.